Those that have spoken, sit down. Grant Robertson.
The call on this occasion. I know it was a tough choice with such an admirable team here ready to take the fight to the national government on this bill. And Mr Chair, I want to speak about the transitional provisions in Part 2, particularly those relating to compensation for earnings and holiday pay. But I just want to make reference to an interjection that we just heard from Sir Roger Douglas when Annette King was saying that this was a bill that ACT support and it's going through with ACT support. And we need to take ourselves back a little in the debate to remember that the ACT Party's support for this bill was actually conditional on moving towards privatisation. That was the ACT Party, and Sir Roger can correct me if he likes, but that was the ACT Party's reason for supporting this bill, that it moved towards privatisation. Now, Sir Roger just said it doesn't go far enough yet. I think that was what he said. But clearly that's the reason why they're supporting this bill. Clearly that's the reason that the direction the National Party wants to go in has to be towards privatisation, because that's why the ACT Party is supporting it. The Māori Party's not. The Māori Party have said today in the House they're not supporting this bill, and I'm sure that's because they believe it is going towards privatisation. So the ACT Party are leading the National Party along here saying, yep, we'll go with you as long as you go in the direction of privatisation, and that agenda is what lies behind this bill. And Peter Dunn, well, we don't know what Peter Dunn's going to do, but I'm sure there'll be a ministerial job at the end of it, whatever it is. Mr Chair, in Part 2 of this bill, we see the essence of the unfairness of this bill, in particular on compensation for earnings. And I want to refer back to the original principles of the Woodhouse Commission that looked in and established ACC, and in particular the principle around real compensation. And I just want to read out what the Commission actually said. The Commission observed that modern households have several financial commitments which do not disappear conveniently if one of the hazards of modern life suddenly produces physical misfortune. And you can understand it. Financial commitments don't go away. We all know about that. We all know about the fixed costs that we have in our lives that we need to meet. And particularly for people who are on lower incomes, particularly for people who undertake seasonal work, they have to work very, very hard to manage their budgets, to know that they will be able to handle things if something comes along. But what New Zealanders did when they accepted the Woodhouse report, when ACC was put in place, was go into a social contract that said, we're not going to sue. We're not going to do anything that's litigious in this because we accept that there will be a scheme that will look after us, 24-hour, no fault. Now, the Commission went on to say that a social compensation system should rest upon assessment of actual loss, both physical and economic, followed by a shifting of that loss, and these are important words, on a suitably generous basis. Now, the figure of 80% for earnings-related compensation was designed to offer real compensation, take into account those words, but leaving a proportion of the loss with the injured person in order to encourage personal initiative. And we can understand that. We've supported that system over a long period of time. Well, under this bill, that system is completely and utterly undermined. And the transitional provisions that we see here will undermine this for a number of workers. If we look particularly at what the bill says, we're returning to the position before the 2008 amendment, where it would ensure that weekly compensation for non-permanent employees would be averaged to reflect the fact that had it not been for the injury, they would have expected periods of earnings and non-earnings over a 12-month period. So what that's doing, it's saying to people who are in casual employment, people who are in employment where they are not certain of their future, that it will be divided over a full 12-month period. And this is going to be unfair and unjust. And the national members opposite need to stand up and say, why are they putting forward a bill in this House that increases unfairness? It increases unfairness. Most of us in this House have come here because we want to see New Zealand be a fair place. Yet we sit here in front of a piece of legislation that actually manifestly increases unfairness. The CTU, in their submission to the Select Committee, cited an interesting example about people who will be treated unfairly as a result of the clauses that we're debating here right now. I'll read out the example that they gave. A woman who has been financially dependent on her husband for most of the year undertakes some seasonal work and gets severely injured on the 4th week of the job. Her $450 per week earnings for 4 weeks of her job is divided by 52 weeks. At 80%, this means that her weekly compensation will be $27 a week. Mr. Chair?
Grant Robertson.
$27 a week, Mr. Chair. How is that fair? How is it fair that somebody in that situation will have their earnings divided over the course of a whole year? The process whereby an employee is categorised as non-permanent is also completely arbitrary under these new changes. It requires ACC to essentially make a guess about how long the employee might have continued working for over the 12-month period. Another unfairness, another way in which the principle of this scheme of real compensation, the principle that Owen Woodhouse brought forward as part of the social contract, is being undermined by these provisions. And if we look at the other key principles, the other one around community responsibility, Mr. Chair, I also think comes up under this area. This is where society accepts that we actually have a responsibility for those who have been hurt through no fault of their own. And Annette King's just talked about people with hearing loss, not through an example of something that they've done to themselves, but because of them doing a job that many people in this House wouldn't want to do. Jobs in heavy industry that they would not want to do. That Michael Woodhouse, who's lectured us today about the ACC scheme, would not want to be doing. But I'm sure he knows many people in Dunedin who do it, many people I'm sure who he's worked alongside in the past, who have done these kinds of jobs. And as a community, well, not alongside, perhaps he knew some of them maybe, probably refereed them when they were playing rugby actually. But that community responsibility is undermined if we say to those people, we don't think you're worth it. We think you're worth $27 a week. That's what we think you're worth. And no hearing aid, that's right. And as Annette King says, no hearing aid. So that principle of the Woodhouse Commission is totally undermined. The other issue, Mr. Chair, that I wanted to raise in this call is around the question of holiday pay. And Clause 58 deals with this. Treasury's pointed out that it saves only $1 million, but it's incredibly unfair for those who have already earned that holiday but have been unlucky enough not to have actually used it. So if we look at two workers with different circumstances, one's up to date and hasn't accrued any holiday pay, and the other's owed 4 weeks before they have an accident. Those two workers under Clause 58 are being treated completely differently, and that is manifestly unfair. We've asked over and over again for members of opposite to take a call and tell us why would they support something that was so manifestly unfair under Clause 58. The bill requires holiday pay, including that accrued before the injury, to be counted and abated against weekly compensation. That will result in manifest unfairnesses right across New Zealand. And every constituency member in this House will have had people come to them to talk about the unfairness of ACC. I had someone come to me on Friday with exactly this problem, unable to work out what this bill's going to mean, dealing with difficulties at the moment and scared about their future and their family. And to have a bill come before this House that puts people in that position is shameful for the National Party. They should be prepared to stand up and take a call on these clauses, Mr. Chair, that actually put into practice the unfairness around compensation for work for hours lost and holiday pay. And yet we have failed to see that from any member, Mr. Chair, and I would like to see the Minister and the Chair at least take one call this morning to defend the bill. One call to defend the bill. We know how much the Minister and the Chair loves talking. She loves talking in this House, but we haven't heard her today. This is an unfair and an unjust bill, Mr. Chair, and this party will continue to oppose it and ask the National Party for answers.